here we have it, Delta 5. It's kind of like So, Delta 5, let's start from the ground up. So, first of all, getting the glider out of the bag. I have to mention the packing that Ozone Factory do is absolutely amazing. It's the best. Packing perfection. It kind of shows a little bit about the attention to detail and quality control that does feedback on that. It's nice that it comes with a simple concertina bag, and certainly the glider has lots of rods. There's a lot of rods. You really need to make sure you're packing this with all the rods straight. Next, I've got to say the build quality is really top notch. Certainly Ozone are one of the best build quality around. The ground handling I've done, I've had mostly a bunch of really all over the place fickle conditions. It's gone from really top end strong gusty, too strong to fly to paraglide, then it's like dropped off and gale hanging and then changed like that. And then I've had everything from those light fickle thermic conditions where it's sort of wafting about all over the place. To be honest, those two extremes are what I'm always kind of looking for a bit in testing a wing, because they're the best test. In moderate conditions, gliders tend to be easy. And overall, with a Delta 5, I found it's definitely right for the class mid-sea, and the general ground handling is definitely right and easy for the class. You do need to make sure with the small sails and the pronounced shark nose, as always, you need to make sure that you get air into the glider before it then inflates and takes its shape up. Once you've got that, then the glider takes up a really well formed shape and comes up nicely, and I'd say kind of exceptionally so. It's a very solid wing, but you do need to get that air into it. So I think in very light fickle conditions, you just got to make sure you give it quite an energetic pull to get the air into it and pull it up. Pleased to say that compared to its predecessor, I found less of a tendency for it's not as sensitive to the tips coming up and clapping hands. Also the Rush 6 and Swift 6 do that a bit, but the Delta 4 and the Alpina have a bit of a tendency to do that, and you need to do a kind of very V shape. Found that with the Delta 5 that seems to be less of an issue. It's less sensitive to that, so that's good. In strong conditions, you do need to give the glider some good impetus to come up, but you don't want to sort of hoik on it too hard. But actually, relatively speaking, I think again it's pretty forgiving. When it gets strong, I generally advocate it's better to bring the glider up round and from the side, which it does very well. I've played around ground handling with it and putting the glider and kiting it up round the side, and I'd say that yeah, it's generally right for the class, mid-sea and good to handle. I wouldn't say it's like some lighter gliders and things like that in light winds I think are a little easier to get inflated and get up into the air, but then there might be in stronger winds they might blow around a bit more and come up a bit sort of with more of a shoot. What I will say is that also quite quickly it becomes apparent that I feel like the Delta 5, quite similar to the Photon and even the Light, it likes a firm hand. If you're being very kind of namby-pamby with it, then it's not going to respond so well, I find. It seems to respond quite well to a firm hand, and it tolerates that. So it's going to also particularly suit pilots who are kind of maybe a bit more firm of hand. Once you dial into how it is, it's quite similar in some ways to the Photon and Light, but easier and with less aspect ratio. It's definitely a good all-round glider for the class. Good for launching all-round, with a particular strength at launching in stronger conditions. On takeoff, as soon as you get that glider up, it's very apparent it's very solid. Although I do feel the glider feels related to the Photon and Light. On the other hand, it feels more taut and solid. There's definitely much less of this kind of moving around, and that also means there's more of I mentioned in our Light review about the sort of bridge suspension, there's a bit less of that, and actually the feedback is a bit more direct, and that I think becomes apparent straight away from when you ground handle the glider. Feel like you've got very solid wing above you, and as you get bumps and turbulence you kind of feel them a bit more than I think you do with the Light and the Photon, which kind of just move around and sort of dampen things out a bit. But at the same time you quickly also get the idea it's a very solid collapse resistant wing, so it's very confidence inspiring from that side. Then launching, taking off, it's got a very good glide and very solid hasn't got a tendency to sort of drift around or snake about. The one thing I'll say about it a little bit that I'm feeling, and this is, I need to test it some more, is I felt like there's a bit of a slight tendency for it to hang back a bit. It's not a wing you want to sort of charge off ahead of. You kind of make sure you've got it with you, and actually it's better to let it go ahead of you a bit and then run off with it. I mean, not way off ahead of you, just a little bit, and then go off, and then that seemed to work better. It's also, we've had some quite gusty, crappy, choppy conditions, so it has been a bit of a test. Yeah, as you go off, if you kind of charge off, and the wing will kind of hang back a little bit. That's particularly, I think, when there's that kind of gusty, crappy conditions. And I found it was better then, as I say, just to let the glider go ahead. This is more of a tip than anything really. I found just let the glider go ahead a little bit. It's very collapse resistant, so then you run with it, and then it was kind of almost like pulling me off the hill. Again, in the air, straight away you have this feeling of like very solid, really exceptionally solid feeling. I think pilots who are flying, I'll be interested to hear pilots who've flown the Delta 4 and who move to the Delta 5. And also even some pilots might have flown the Photon and decided to step down to the Delta 5 maybe. I'll be interested to hear what their feedback is. But yeah, there's definitely a kind of, I needed to sort of dial into it a bit more because it is very solid feeling. I think the feedback is a little bit more on the dampened side. Having said that, while I was flying around, you've got to let the glider, this kind of class of glider, you've got to let them fly. If you fly around with a load of brake on, so you're not going to get the best out of them. To be honest, even high mid-Bs, you don't get the best out of them that way. But if you just fly around with the brake, you've got to let them fly and also be ready to fly active, but by letting them fly, that's how they glide best, and they give you the best feeling of the air. But I feel like with this sort of glider, it's kind of, because it is more solid and a bit more dampened and on the very reassuring side, then it's kind of, you have to kind of tune in a bit more when the conditions, trying to find this. So even though we've had, our conditions were quite snotty and punchy, trying to get and find the lift has been quite tricky. And so you needed a glider to help you feel that. And my tip there is just let the glider fly, feel through the risers, feel what the air's doing, and then I could find that I was able to find the lift. But I'd say that certainly there are some other gliders, for me particularly some of the current best 2.5, 3 liners, that in those conditions I think shine out better. They have more feeling and feedback, and so you can find that more subtle lift a bit better. But where the Delta 5 really shines is that it's very solid, and so when it gets more sporty and punchy, you're feeling very confident about the wing. So on to now turning and handling. So I think it's fair to say with a Photon on a light, fantastic wings, but one of the main things that pilots have generally said, and we've said, is we'd like them to be a bit more agile and a bit more nimble. A good pilot can make the gliders turn and perfectly well enough, and they tolerate that. It seems like with the Delta 5, it seemed like the Ozone team has tried to make it a bit more agile, and I think it is a bit more on the agile side. It's still got a very solid tendency to want to turn relatively flat, but here's the difference. So one, already we've had one quite different to the Photon and light, is that more kind of solid, less suspension in the feedback, so it's a little bit more bit more direct. The difference is with the feedback is that you get this kind of, if you hit sudden choppy air, then you feel that quite more suddenly, whereas with the Photon and light it's a bit more dampened out. So with the Delta 5 I found that I think the brakes are a little bit shorter, so it does feel like the brakes are a bit shorter, and also they're a bit more direct, and also the glider has a little bit more, when you pull the brake hard, then the glider will tend to, you can make that tip dig in a bit more and give it a bit more roll. The combination of the shorter aspect ratio, I think also that very solid wing, which gives a more direct feeling and more direct handling, that it's easier to make the glider, if you want to hit a core and you want to just crank it and bank it round, then it does that more easily. I think it does climb very well. My feeling so far is that it climbs better in stronger climbs. So compared to the Photon, which does very well in weak stuff as well, because of that I think it does tend to turn flatter. So with the Delta 5 I felt like slightly different is that I can make the glider dig in the turn more easily, and then I want to be using a little bit of high siding, you know, a bit of outer brake, a bit of weight shift out just to straighten out momentarily, maybe a little bit of outer brake, and then back in again to keep it more efficient. If I just stuffed the brake and did that, had a little bit more of a tendency for it to go a little bit nose down and be not quite as efficient. But then you can use the outer brake to straighten that up and climb out. To me, the Delta 5 does feel quite related to the Photon. That's just how it feels to me. But there are some quite noticeable differences in how they behave, both how they launch, how they fly, but particularly the feeling of the wing and the handling. All right, let's talk about speed bar and then flying on the bees, using the bees. So the speed system. Well, the speed system is pretty light. I think it's even lighter than the Photon and the Light. Very usable. I think this is probably another quite a good strength of the Delta 5. And it's that one area again, typically that two-liners tend on average to have a bit of an advantage over three-liners. And I think the Delta 5, that's a real strength of it. It's clearly a glider that the speed system has been made to be very usable. As well as being light, the glider stays very solid. I did notice a little bit of dimpling and stuff like that on them, just a little bit, and a little bit of flutter. Whereas I think the Photon and the Light just don't have any of that. Very solid, but still very solid, very clean. The speed bar right to full pulleys locked out is very solid and usable. It does get a little bit right at the very top of the right end part of the speed bar. It does start to feel a little bit, you can get that little bit more edginess, but it still feels very, very solid and very usable. But one of the key things to mention here is now the bees. So they are much lighter than they are on the Photon and the Light. They're actually quite light, not excessively so, but they're definitely on the light side. And whereas with the Photon I feel they're firm but direct, I think with the Delta 5 they feel light and still quite direct, but not quite as direct. But what I can definitely say is the bee risers are quite a lot lighter to use, even without the bar on, but especially when you put the bar on, then they're light, which doesn't make them very easy to use and move. You need a bit more of a bigger movement to get the equivalent kind of reaction of the wing, which makes sense with the lower aspect ratio and deeper chord. Acceleration, it feels very good. On average, it might have been around the sort of 14 kilometers an hour, but honestly, I was just watching as I was gliding repeatedly, keeping my course, my ground speed just going up and down, up and down, up and down. But feels like a very good turn of speed. I think that's where the Delta 5, compared to some other mid-sea gliders, 3-liners and 2.5-liners, I think that it's where it may have an edge on those. Obviously one of the main competitors to the Delta 5 is the Nova Codex, because they are very much the same sort of idea, the kind of easy sea 2-liners, the kind of mid-sea easy sea 2-liners. And descent techniques, I did do big ears, tip stalls, a bit of a spiral. So really on that one it's kind of like cut and paste from the Light and the Photon a bit. Well, so classic big ears with the A's, the outer A's, so it does them, but they are very firm and hard to collapse, much more so than generally 2.5 and 3-liners, particularly 3-liners will feel. And so you do need to, well, I put on half bar, then reached up. First of all, I didn't reach up high enough and I pulled them, and just like with the Light, they just kind of bend down but didn't collapse. So I just had to reach up a bit higher and then pull them in really nice and firmly. Generally, because I've got bar on, I prefer to pull them in together. I know that there's generally a thing about, oh, you might induce a front collapse. Well, it's quite resistant to front collapsing, so I don't think it's an issue. When you pull in one side, particularly on bar, what you'll find is you tend to turn off course quite a bit. So I prefer to do it that way. The main point is, it does them well. Actually, once you get them in, they're effective. They're not too hard to hold in, because the wing is, you've kind of broken the tips of the wing, as it were. You've got them to collapse and they sit there. The sail gets pressed against the lines, so they hold in place. They are quite effective as well, so that's very usable. Next, tip stalls, very similar to the Light. They're quite easy and not as high pressure as tip stalls normally are. Still high pressure, but relatively easy, but they are very small. The descent rate you get out of them is not very much. It's a little bit. So you'd only use that if you didn't want to bother doing the big ears, because they're a bit hard to pull in, and you just were you wanted a little bit of descent, say again, gliding out from a cloud. I personally think that with the Delta 5, I would be using the classic big ears when I needed to. But if you really need to get down, then you do a spiral dive. So in summary, for the Delta 5, I think the thing that really stand out feature of it to me is it's a very solid collapse resistant wing. It's built to handle turbulence and chop and handle that very well. It's very firm and it's got a very direct feedback. It's not as soft the feedback as say the Photon. I think pilots also moving from the Delta 4 will find an adjustment period to it where the feedback from the Delta 5 is very direct. It's a little bit like when you have a vehicle that doesn't have so soft suspension. It's more like it's a harder suspension on it. But I think again it's one of those things you just get used to. At first it's kind of like wow, you're getting this quite direct, firm feedback, but then as you fly the glider more, you realise it's just very solid, and that's how it's built. Agility, definitely a bit more agile than the Photon, and more of a tendency you can make the glider bank and roll more. The performance feels very good for the class mid-sea. The rear risers are relatively light, so the Bs, and easy to use, and the feedback is good, but it feels like it's definitely on the sort of much softer, much lighter, softer than the Photon, but I feel maybe not quite as direct feeling as well. Certainly what I can say is there's more travel to get the same effect. Speed system is very light and usable. The glider picks up speed very well, and the glide feels very good. I did manage to test one of my key wings. I want to test the glider again in the class. Both, I'm going to be testing it both against 3-liners, 2.5 and 2-liners. The most obvious contender, I think, is the 2-liner, is the Nova Codex, and the other one is the BGD Cure 2. Check our reviews of these wings as well. So I'm going to be looking forward to testing the Delta 5 lots more, getting to know it well, and comparing it with other wings. There's a sheep looking at me over there going, what are you talking about? See you in the next video.